Yeah, so if you want to get jacked, just do the basics.
Is it really that simple? Is that really what training for strength and size is all about? Yes and no. Let's define the basics real quick. Back in my day, I was another schmuck that overcomplicated their workouts, doing 6 sets per exercise 6 times per week, completely locked out of the basics. Through lots of trial and error, I eventually found out what I actually needed. Training muscles 2 times per week, 3 to 6 sets per muscle per session, training hard and progressively, calories and protein, and 8+ hours of sleep. Since then, I've made great progress, so yes, the basics are reliable and never get old. However, people become completely fixed on this mentality and then wonder why they can't make progress in the intermediate stage. Training can actually get quite complex as you want to push more out of it. Once you have established working harder, then you need to work smarter. Of course, as you gain more experience, your progress will slow down, but a lot of people end up demotivated thinking they're near their potential when it's simply not true. You just need to make the right optimizations. So in this video, I'll show you common exercise execution mistakes, managing intermediate workload, smarter exercise selection, and an intermediate progression scheme. So let's get into this shit. Starting off, a common issue I see is extending failure, delaying the point you will reach failure in an exercise through cheating. Cheat reps have a mixed reputation. People will either think they're a complete ass, or people will be on the opposite side using cheat reps wherever they can. What usually ends up happening is people using more cheat reps than necessary and not even doing them properly, just resulting in a worse stimulus altogether because mechanical tension on the target muscle is ultimately what we're after. If you start a set of standard curls, but before you even reach failure, you start using momentum to help, those aren't proper cheat reps. You need to reach true muscular failure first with proper form, which is quite hard to do, and then once your biceps are truly exhausted, you take them further with cheat reps. Another common issue is having an inconsistent tempo. You see this sometimes with bench. You'll start with a controlled descent and some pause, and as the set goes on, the descent gets faster and the pause gets shorter. Now if you still reach a high intensity, you're still stimulating the muscle, but then your progressive overload is harder to track because did you get stronger or did you just more efficiently rib trampoline the weight up? Make sure every eccentric counts as well, at least one good second, especially on the very last rep. It's common for people to get the final rep up and then just basically let go of the set, skipping the last eccentric when it is literally the most important part of the set. The next common issue is even simpler than the other two. You may just simply not be pushing your isolations hard enough. You know, I already did my compounds, man. I trained hard and progressively added 5 pounds. It shouldn't affect me if I half-ass isolations, right? This mindset can be acceptable as a beginner, but you have to grow out of it as time goes on, and be open to caring about other exercises besides just the basic compounds. You can get away with less intensity earlier on as you are learning, or if you have some condition/injury. However, as you become more advanced, you require more stimulus. At a minimum, you should be reaching failure on every set for lighter isolations past the beginner stage. There should be no injury risk if you're perfectly healthy. You should go as far as to go past failure with higher intensity techniques like drop sets or cheat reps as I talked about before. One quick way to tell if you are training hard enough is to look at the reps across all of your sets. If you can get the same reps across the first set and any of the rest, 1. You are not training hard enough, or 2. You trained hard enough but used more cheating on the next set, which is still not a good idea to track as the same reps anyways. If you train a failure, you should not be able to replicate the same reps with the same form in the next set. You should lose at least 1 rep. This should be more apparent if you do your isolations last in the workout. Last up is just not checking on your form enough. Some people like to rely on their intuition for form, even on heavier compound lifts where form is even more important. Make sure you record your sets at least once a month for each exercise, or have somebody more experienced watch you. You'll be able to more quickly catch imbalances and weaknesses so you can clear them up. Alright, next up. The tricky part here is that volume is different for everybody. However, as a beginner, you have so much more room to recover, so you can get away with doing volume you probably shouldn't, which can bleed into when you become an intermediate. First up with a quick tip. Let's say you've got quite a bit of experience and have already been recovering pretty well from your workouts. Your sets typically have matching reps or a small drop off. For example, in your first set on the bench press, you get 8 reps, then you get 7, and then 7 again in the last set. That is normal. Now let's say your later sets start dipping down. Your first set is 9 reps, and then your next set is down to 6 reps, and then the one after is 5 reps. Let's say this happens again in the next session. This just means you had extra fatigue while performing the exercise, so you should just skip that last set for now to allow yourself to clear up. Even just one less set can provide good recovery benefits. Deloads can also work here too if this seems to be affecting multiple larger exercises. This brings me to my next point. Your ability to handle workload changes with experience. It gets worse as you can handle heavier loads. Squatting 200 pounds for 5 reps to failure is very different from 400 pounds for 5 reps to failure. One of the examples I like to point out is Max Yusita. He started with extraordinarily high volumes, which can get you a good looking physique, but if you want to take it further than that, well, it didn't work out for him. His progress stagnated over a year until he made 2 key changes. 1, he drastically reduced his volume, and 2, he drastically increased the quality of each set using what I outlined in the previous chapter: technique, better tempo, and better intensity. This did 2 things. It raised his growth stimulus per set while not overshooting recovery. This allowed him to start progressing again, and currently he looks better than ever. So if you are currently doing upwards of 18 plus sets per week, I mean, if you are progressing just fine, go for it, but if you begin to stagnate, I'd experiment with lower volume, higher quality work. This chart covers most of it. If you feel good and progress well, stay right where you are. If you progress well and feel shit, there is a good chance you are on the bleeding edge of under-recovering, so a deload or some minor reduction to make the workload more sustainable is probably imminent. If you progress bad but feel good, you most likely need to either increase the workload or increase the quality of that workload. Lastly, if you progress poorly and feel like shit, then 100% decrease the workload. With your machines and isolations, I would 100% look to maximize quality and reduce volume. With heavy compounds and free weights, it's a slightly different story. Heavy free weight compound lifts are less safe to push intensity on beyond a certain point. I'd say 0 to 1 reps in reserve. As you get stronger, they can become too systemically fatiguing to repeatedly lift hard and heavy every session. Around 90% of your max for 0 to 1 RIR. What you can experiment here with is just variation with the volume and intensity. Try out rep ranges like 8 to 12 or 10 to 15 for a bit. You'll probably see a surge of new growth once you go back to your lower rep ranges. The more popular method for this is known as intensifying, where you start at higher volumes at a slightly lower intensity, then drop volume and increase intensity as each week progresses. The differences in volume and intensity cancel each other out to allow for recovery and to make strength progress while still being able to lift with low volumes and high intensities. The hard PR attempts are just spaced out further apart. This is a very important principle to understand for intermediate progressions, and the reason this doesn't really apply to isolations is because they don't really get very systemically fatiguing, so you can afford to just continue training hard and hard and hard every session and prioritizing quality volume. So essentially, look for faults in your workload using how you are progressing and how you feel, look to maximize intensity and lower volume with isolations, and vary volume/intensity with other, more taxing movements, such as trying different rep ranges or specific program structures. Is this worsened workload counteractable? Yes, it is. Most lifters just don't do it. However, there are diminished returns with it. Regardless, I recommend everybody look into improving their work capacity. Too many people become overly dogmatic, being against cardio or prioritizing long rest times. If you even mention the idea of a superset, you immediately get shot down with, "Why would you ever superset 2 movements? You'll just perform worse for both." Take a look at this video and it should help you out. Anyways, next up. Utilizing more isolation exercises and compound lift variations becomes highly beneficial. This gets looked down upon for some reason as the dogma of pure basic compounds from the beginner stage and gets carried over to the intermediate stage where it's less applicable. With new or current exercises, you want to be looking for 3 main criteria. 1, it's a stable lift. What makes a lift stable is if you can generate max force against the weight without disturbance, but also if the exercise doesn't change drastically as the weight climbs. So for example, tricep pushdowns, they're a great basic movement. However, once you get strong enough, then you need something to hold you down, or you need to switch to a single arm. So you're probably gonna have to use a different variation of the tricep pushdowns. 2, it provides enough range of motion. This is self-explanatory. You don't want to be relying on quarter squatting and above the knee rack pulls for growth. And lastly, the exercise has either a flat or descending resistance curve. This means the exercise provides resistance throughout or has the most at the bottom. Exercises that fit this criteria include hack squats, the upright T-bar row machine, preacher curls, cable lateral raises, etc. This has been shown to provide greater hypertrophy, albeit there's a new video that sets that premise on fire. However, there is another benefit to these types of resistance curves. It's that grinding reps is a lot smoother. On a lot of rowing exercises, they're hardest at the top, so they have an ascending resistance curve. So what failure would look like is the weight just goes like halfway up without too much effort, but then just sticks, which feels very awkward. However, with the flatter descending resistance curve, you'll actually be able to have reps that get pretty slow, but you're still able to push through them, and you're way better able to gauge intensity that way. Don't confuse all of this though with a deep stretch. I'd say more tension in the lengthened position means more gains. Look for exercises that fit 2 or more of these criteria. So for example, swap dumbbell lateral raises for machine lateral raises as they fit criteria 3 better. The SBD barbell versions are also not specifically mandatory. I love these lifts to death, but you can also of course swap them out for less systemically fatiguing variations. Using this, another thing I recommend incorporating into your routine is alternate exercises. The idea is that for every compound exercise exercise you have 1 to 2 other exercises which you could do in case of 4 factors: how long you've done the original exercises, how much systemic fatigue you have built up, whether you feel pain in the original exercise, and equipment availability. If you have done an exercise for a very long time, no, I'm not going to tell you there's a need to swap it. It just means it should be considered for swapping. However, if you have not done an exercise for at least 4 weeks, you shouldn't be swapping it out. You need to give yourself time to adapt, unless you get an injury, of course. If you find you have systemic fatigue built up, you find yourself constantly retrying for a PR in a lift but unable to break through the strength plateau, you could try switching to the alternate exercise for the time being, then coming back to the original exercise after 4 weeks. Alternate exercises can also provide a pain-free alternative, which is very useful for helping fight inflammation of the joints from overuse. Lastly, they can come in clutch when your gym is busy and everyone is hogging the equipment you want. Alright, next up. So you probably know what progressive overload is already. Either you have been using rep ranges or some type of just add 5 pounds per week progression. These are great progression schemes, and I would recommend sticking with rep ranges for all of your accessories. However, with your first lifts like the heavy compound lifts, I would recommend trying out different progression schemes once linear progression starts stagnating. You'll know you hit a wall when recovery and everything is dialed in, but you're just unable to progress. You add 5 pounds and you get like 1 to 2 less reps, and that repeats over and over. The issue here is that systemic fatigue is just too high from session to session, but you require more time and stimulus to make the necessary adaptations to progress. So what other progression schemes focus on is extending the time between PR attempts to allow smoother progression. My most recommended one is 5-3-1. This is known as a wave progression, as the relative weight you use climbs up and down in a wave pattern, resetting and building back up to higher peaks. How it works is that it forces you to progress in 3 different thresholds, so either your 5s, 3s, and 1s. This draws out the progression to be once every 3 weeks, as you are only progressing in the same threshold after 2 more weeks. At the end of 6 weeks after the 1s week, you add weight and deload. That's the gist of it, but I'll let you research more into it since there's a lot of modifications people like to make. This progression only accounts for 1 session per week for a certain lift, so if you were hitting them 2 times a week before and want to use this, then I'd recommend having the second session be an alternate exercise you use a rep range on instead. Alright, that's it. I can talk to you personally and give you direct help with the first link in the description. If not, you can join the Discord server instead. Here's that video on work capacity again, which you should watch if you're the type of person to be exhausted after bench pressing.